You've never mattered. My mom sneered. Half the time. We forget you exist. My brother laughed. I tapped my fork on my glass. Voice calm. 3 sentences. That's all. By the second. Her face turned ghostly pale. I didn't react. Didn't cry. Didn't even blink. Just watched the truth hit. I was 44 when I finally decided I'd had enough. My name is Evelyn Parker. And for most of my life, I've carried the weight of other people's choices that cut me out of my own story. For years, I let it happen. I swallowed the bitterness, convinced myself it was just family dynamics, and told everyone I was fine. But the truth was, I was living in the shadow of lies so thick they almost felt real. That Sunday afternoon, I walked into my mother's house with a steady step and a leather briefcase in my hand. It was an old case. Dark brown. The kind you might see in an antique shop. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing more than a relic of another era. But I knew what was inside. Pages and pages of proof. Evidence sharp enough to slice through every lie that had been wrapped around my life for more than 20 years. I took my seat at the far end of the long dining table, the briefcase resting beside me. I didn't open it yet, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted them to feel the moment before it happened, the pause before a storm. I glanced at each face around the table, the familiar ones I had grown up with, and wondered if they had any idea what was about to hit them. I've been silent too long, I thought, and today, I'm giving it all back, every stolen truth. Every betrayal using only 3 sentences. The old house sat at the end of a quiet road. Its white paint faded to a dull cream, the shutters leaning slightly from years of weather. I'd walked through that front door 1,000 times before. But that afternoon, I noticed details I had never let myself linger on: how the porch steps creaked unevenly under my weight, how the smell of lemon polish and stale air clung to the hallway, how the framed family photographs seemed to watch me as I passed. The dining room was exactly as it had always been. The same heavy oak table stretching almost the length of the room. The lace curtains filtering in the muted sunlight. My mother sat at her usual place, upright and proper. A glass of iced tea beside her. Across from her was Harold, my stepfather, his shirt crisp, his watch glinting every time he reached for his wine glass. And then there was Dylan, my younger brother, already halfway through a plate of ribs, steam still rising from the meat. My place setting was at the far end, a plate with a slice of cold pie and a glass of water. No entrée. No steam. Nothing warm. I didn't comment. The sound of silverware clinking against plates filled the silence, punctuated by the occasional murmur of approval whenever Dylan spoke. He was talking about a big project at his company, something about updating a software interface for a local business. Everyone leaned in like he was revealing state secrets. My mother's eyes sparkled with pride. Harold nodded like a board member listening to a CEO. And Dylan basked in the glow of their approval. When he finished describing his accomplishment, Harold raised his glass in a small toast. "That's our boy," he said. Grinning, my mother added, "Always making us proud." I waited for the natural shift in conversation. The moment when someone might mention the conference. I'd just returned from the one where I was invited to speak as a keynote at an international medical symposium. But it didn't come. Instead, my mother turned to ask Dylan about his weekend plans. As if my trip, my work, my life, had never happened at all. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. This wasn't new. This was the pattern. Dylan did something ordinary, and it was celebrated. I achieved something extraordinary, and it was quietly erased. I sipped my water, my eyes drifting to the briefcase, resting at my side. Its weight was a constant reminder of why I was here. Why I had chosen this Sunday, this meal to bring the truth into the light. I listened to their voices. The laughter at Dylan's latest joke. The way Harold's smug tone filled the air. And I let it all wash over me. The more they ignored me, the calmer I felt. I wasn't here to be seen by them. I was here to make them see what they had worked so hard to hide. And when the time came, there would be no turning back. That's when I set my fork down. Letting the quiet click of metal against porcelain draw their attention, the first small crack in an otherwise perfectly controlled afternoon. I let the room carry on for a few more minutes, my gaze shifting from face to face, cataloging the small tells I knew so well. Harold's self-satisfied smirk as he cut into his roast, Dylan's little habit of leaning back in his chair, arms crossed like he was holding court, my mother's deliberate stillness, the way she sat like a queen presiding over a family that had long since decided who mattered and who didn't. I rested my hands on my lap, feeling the smooth leather of the briefcase under my fingertips. I'd waited for this moment for months. Perhaps years if I was honest with myself. And now, watching them all carry on as if I were an afterthought, I felt the clarity of purpose settle in me, like a steady flame. Without a word, I drew the briefcase onto the table. The scrape of it against the wood was louder than I intended. But maybe that was a good thing. 3 sets of eyes turned toward me. "What's that?" Harold asked, his tone casual but tinged with curiosity. I met his gaze for a moment, then shifted my attention to my mother. 3 sentences, I said, my voice even, almost quiet, but edged with steel. Her brows lifted just slightly, the kind of expression she used when she thought she was humoring me. 3 sentences, she repeated, a faint chuckle, slipping out like she already knew how this would go. I clicked open the brass latches. The sound was sharp in the stillness. Lifting the lid, I pulled out a slim folder and slid it across the table toward her. My mother's smile didn't falter at first, but as she reached for the folder and opened it, I watched the color drain from her face. Her fingers tightened around the pages, her eyes darting over the lines as though the words themselves might rearrange into something more palatable if she stared hard enough. "What is this?" she asked. But the bravado was gone. Her voice had thinned. I leaned forward slightly, my elbows on the table, my eyes never leaving hers. "Do you remember an email from 2001? I asked, my tone almost conversational. "Because I do. I remember it very well." The air in the room shifted. Dylan's chair scraped against the floor as he leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Harold's smirk faded, replaced by a sharp, assessing stare. But my mother, she just sat there, still holding the papers, her knuckle pale, her lips pressing into a thin line. In that moment, it wasn't about the pie in front of me or the ribs on Dylan's plate. It wasn't about the coldness I'd endured or the years of being dismissed. This was the first stone thrown into the still pond of their control, and the ripples were already moving outward. I sat back, letting the silence stretch. We all knew what came next, even if they didn't want to face it yet, and I was ready to take them there. I was 9, the year I learned what it meant to be invisible. It was a Saturday morning in early spring, the kind where the air still carried a bite, but the sunlight promised warmer days. I sat at the polished black piano in the school auditorium, my feet barely reaching the pedals, my hands trembling above the keys. I had practiced for months, hours each night after homework, my small fingers stretching across octaves until they ached. When the first note rang out, the rest of the world disappeared. When it was over, they called my name. First place. All-state piano competition. My teacher squeezed my shoulder and said, "You've earned this," before stepping away to let me pose for a photo with my ribbon. I remember scanning the crowd, searching for the familiar faces I had begged to come. My mother, Harold, even Dylan. But the seats where they might have been were empty. That night, I came home clutching my ribbon in one hand and my sheet music in the other. The house smelled faintly of barbecue. Laughter drifted from the kitchen. I stepped inside to find Dylan in the center of it all, a bronze basketball medal hanging around his neck. The table covered with paper plates and half-eaten cake. "Our champion," Harold boomed, lifting his glass. My mother beamed, fussing over Dylan like he'd just been drafted to the NBA. I stood in the doorway for a moment before slipping the ribbon into my coat pocket. No one asked where I'd been. No one noticed the faint imprint of piano keys still etched into my fingertips. It was like that often. The spotlight always seemed to find Dylan. Even when I was the one standing on a stage, he'd bring home a B on a math test, and they'd make a production out of it. I'd bring home straight A's. And it was barely a footnote. Over time, I stopped expecting them to care. But there were moments I couldn't ignore, like the nights we all sat at the dinner table. The clink of silverware against plates, the only sound, until Harold would break it, with some question about Dylan's day. The conversation would spin around him, his friends, his team, his grades, and when it circled my way, it would stall. Sometimes my mother would ask about school, but her eyes would already be drifting elsewhere. Before I could answer, I learned to keep my stories to myself. I learned to smile politely when they forgot my birthday or called me by the wrong nickname. I learned to hold my applause for Dylan's small victories, because mine never seemed to warrant the same in return. Still, that day at the piano stayed with me. Not for the win, but for the empty space in the audience, the cold seat that should have been warm with someone who loved me enough to show up. I didn't understand it then. Not fully. But I was beginning to. In our house, a love was rationed, and I was always last in line. I was 12 when the ground beneath me shifted for the first time. It was a gray afternoon, the kind that seemed to press the clouds low over the rooftops. I came home from school to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. She didn't look up when I walked in, just slid a single sheet across the table toward me. "You should read this," she said. It was an email, printed out on plain white paper. At the top was my father's name. I hadn't seen him in months, not since the shouting matches and slammed doors that had ended with him moving out. My heart lifted for a split second, thinking maybe he was writing to me. But as my eyes moved over the words, that hope collapsed. "I don't want custody of Evelyn. I don't think I can be the kind of parent she needs." I read it twice, 3 times, waiting for the letters to rearrange themselves into something else. My father was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, who made pancakes in the shape of animals on Saturday mornings. He was the one who used to sit at the foot of my bed and listen when I couldn't sleep. And now he didn't want me? My chest felt hollow. The paper trembled in my hands. I looked at my mother, searching for some kind of explanation. But she only said, "You need to understand. It's better this way." I went to my room and closed the door. I stared at that page until the words blurred. And finally I folded it into a tight square and tucked it into a shoebox under my bed. For weeks, I carried that weight with me everywhere, through classes, through piano practice, through every awkward family dinner where his absence was just another thing we didn't talk about. It would be years before I learned the truth. That email had never come from my father at all. It was fabricated, written, sent, and printed in this very house to sever the bond between us. My mother, with Harold's help, had built a wall and told me it was my father who put it there. The day I found out, it was like the floor gave way beneath me, all over again. Only this time, the pain was sharper, because I realized I had mourned someone who hadn't actually abandoned me. I had mourned a lie, and that lie became the backdrop for my teenage years. Shaping the person I was becoming, I learned to keep my distance. I learned to stop expecting people to stay, and I carried that quiet, simmering anger like a stone in my pocket, heavy, but always there. By the time I was 15, The house had gone quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that made you notice the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the sound of your own fork scraping the plate. Dinner was usually just me at the table. My mother and Harold were often out charity events, business dinners, or simply too busy to sit down together. Dylan ate with friends or holed up in his room after basketball practice, his voice echoing faintly from the phone as he laughed with someone on the other end. I would eat slowly, not because I was savoring the food, but because there was nothing to rush toward once the meal was over. No one asked me about my day. No one noticed if I didn't eat at all. The silence stretched between bites, and I learned how to fill it in my head with imagined conversations I wished I could have. At school, I blended in so well, I sometimes wondered if I was becoming invisible. I was the girl who handed in assignments early, the one who slipped out of the classroom before anyone noticed I'd left. I didn't talk about the piano competitions I'd stopped entering or the songs I still played in the empty music room when no one was around. No one knew that I dreamed of studying music at a conservatory, of standing on a stage under the glow of warm lights, letting my fingers tell the stories my voice couldn't. I didn't tell them, because I'd already learned dreams weren't something you handed to people who might crush them without even realizing. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie in bed and trace my life like a line on a map. I could see the places where it bent, where it broke, where it narrowed to a point. I thought about that email in the shoebox under my bed, about the father I believed had turned away, about the family dinners that felt like rehearsals for a play I hadn't been cast in. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness, it was the growing certainty that no one even noticed, that I could disappear and the rhythms of the house would carry on unchanged. I existed. Yes, I breathed. I went to school. I came home. I played my piano when no one was listening. But existing isn't the same as living. And somewhere in the quiet, I began to understand the difference. I didn't have the words for it back then. But looking back now, I can sum up those years in a single sentence. I existed, but I never really lived. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day you don't expect to change your life. I was attending a medical conference in the city, something my department had pushed me to do for professional development. I sat through panels on patient care, innovation, and policy, scribbling notes in my tidy handwriting, keeping my mind on work, not my personal history. During a coffee break, I found myself in line for tea, idly checking my phone. A colleague, Lisa, walked up with a tall man beside her. Evelyn, this is Thomas, she said. He works in rural health outreach. Used to be a physician before moving into advocacy. I turned to shake his hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes, there was something in them that caught me off guard. The moment stretched, and then he said, softly, Evelyn? My name sounded different coming from him. Heavier, like it carried years behind it. Yes, I replied, confused. He swallowed hard. I'm your father. Lie. I froze. My first thought was that it had to be some awful joke. But then I saw it, the same shape of eyes I'd seen in old photographs, the same uneven brow, and in an instant, the memory of that printed email in my shoebox flashed into my mind. He stepped closer, his voice breaking. I didn't leave you. I didn't walk away. I've been trying to find you for years. I could feel the air shift around us, the conference noise fading into a distant hum. The email, I started, but my throat closed. His eyes filled. That wasn't me. Evelyn, I never wrote it. I never stopped wanting you in my life. The words hit me like a wave, knocking the wind out of everything I thought I knew. I wanted to believe him. And yet the years of silence stood between us like a wall. My voice trembled. Why now? After all this time, I found out you were in the city? He said, his hands shaking as he reached for a folded piece of paper. I've been working with a friend in law enforcement. I had to see you. To tell you the truth myself. I don't know how long we stood there. Speaking in half sentences. Choking back tears. He told me about the letters he'd sent that never reached me. The birthdays he'd marked on his calendar. The addresses that always came back undelivered. Something shifted inside me that day, not a full healing. Not yet. But a crack in the wall I'd been living behind. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. If the email was a lie, then there was more to the story. And if there was more to the story, then maybe I could finally uncover it. By the time we parted, I had his number saved in my phone and a quiet determination in my chest. This wasn't going to be just a reunion. It was going to be an investigation. I walked out of the conference hall into the crisp evening air. The city lights starting to glow against the darkening sky. My entire life had been shaped by a single piece of paper. And now I knew it might have been forged. I didn't care how long it would take or how deep I'd have to dig. I was going to find the truth. And this time, I wouldn't let anyone bury it. I didn't waste any time after meeting my father. The moment I got home from that conference, I started researching how to dig deeper. This wasn't something I could stumble through. I needed real skills. That's when I found an evening course for private investigation training, taught by a retired detective who'd spent 30 years in cybercrime. The first night I walked into that small classroom, I felt out of place. Most of the students were either young, tech-savvy types or ex-military looking to transition into security work. I was just a woman in her 40s with a worn leather notebook and a hunger for the truth, but I sat down in the front row, flipped to a clean page, and started writing. We began with the basics: how to recover deleted files, trace IP addresses, and read the subtle fingerprints left behind in digital activity. It felt like learning a new language, one made up of code strings, file path, and metadata timestamps. Every concept made me realize how much had been invisible to me before, and how easily someone could plant or erase evidence if you didn't know where to look. I kept a thick, spiral-bound notebook where I documented everything in my own words. I didn't just write down the steps. I drew diagrams, annotated screenshots, and created flowcharts of the processes. At home, I'd stay up past midnight practicing on my old laptop, downloading recovery software, and digging through dummy files I'd deleted myself. The more I learned, the more my determination sharpened. Some nights I'd brew a fresh pot of coffee at 10 p.m., telling myself I'd only work for an hour, only to find the birds starting to chirp when I finally shut the computer down. My friends stopped asking me to go out in the evenings. My coworkers noticed the circles under my eyes. I didn't care. Every late night felt like another step toward arming myself for the fight ahead. There were moments I doubted myself, times when the technical jargon seemed overwhelming. When I'd hit a dead end on a practice trace and want to slam the laptop shut, but then I'd think about that meeting with my father, the tears in his eyes, and the years we'd lost. I'd think about that email I'd read over and over as a teenager, letting it break me, not knowing it might have been a lie. That pain became my fuel. I wasn't learning these skills for a certificate or a new career. I was learning them because someone had stolen my life's truth, and I was going to take it back. I started carrying my notebook everywhere: on the bus, at lunch breaks, even propped open on the kitchen counter while I cooked. It became my battle plan, its pages smudged with coffee stains and the edge of my handwriting pressed deep into the paper. By the end of the course, I could navigate digital forensics software without feeling lost. I could look at an email's header and tell you which server it had passed through, at what time, and from where. I knew how to spot an alias account, how to recover deleted documents, how to connect dots others might overlook. And most importantly, I'd stopped feeling powerless. I might have been just one person, but I was no longer a passive victim of whatever story had been written for me. I was becoming a quiet, methodical fighter, one who understood that justice doesn't always roar into your life. Sometimes, It comes from the silent, sleepless hours when no one's watching. When you're piecing together fragments in the dark, I knew the next step was to put everything I'd learned into practice. That meant going to the one place I had avoided for years, my mother's old belongings. Somewhere in there, I was certain, the truth was waiting for me to find it. I waited until late one evening to start. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every creak of the floorboards sound deafening. My mother's old computer sat in the corner of the study, humming softly, a relic from another decade. I hadn't touched it in years, but I knew it was the key. I plugged in an external hard drive and booted the system, my fingers steady despite the adrenaline building in my chest. The screen flickered to life, dusty icons populating the desktop like ghosts of the past. I opened the email client first, scanning the inbox and sent items, looking for anything that could shed light on the years of lies. It didn't take long. There it was, a draft, buried deep in the folders, labeled simply, Custody, Email 2001. My heart leapt. I opened it slowly. Reading the words I had memorized years ago, I don't want custody of Evelyn, except now. The metadata told a different story. It had never been sent. It was created on this very computer. By someone with access, someone I knew. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of that confirmation settle over me. I wasn't imagining it. My mother had forged it. Next, I dug through the messaging application. There it was again, conversations between her and Harold, discussing how to cover their tracks, creating aliases and fake accounts to funnel money. My father's accounts, the ones I had assumed had dwindled due to poor management, were being siphoned off into hidden pockets they had created under false names. Every message, every log, every timestamp was a thread that, when pulled, unraveled the whole scheme. The thrill and terror collided. I could feel the stakes in every keystroke as I copied files, screenshots, and logs onto my hard drive. Each discovery was a nail in the coffin of their deception. Each confirmation, making the years of betrayal tangible. The room felt smaller with every click, my pulse thundering in my ears. I worked late into the night, my eyes stinging from the glare of the monitor. I cross-referenced bank accounts, recovered deleted files, and traced IP addresses back to the house. The evidence was overwhelming in its clarity, brutal in its precision. I finally understood the depth of their manipulation, the lengths they had gone to erase me from the truth and steal what was rightfully my father's. When the sun began to peek through the blinds, I shut the computer with a sense of grim satisfaction. My notebook, filled with diagrams and notes, had guided me through the maze. Every checkmark, every annotation, every recovered file was a step closer to closure. I had the proof I needed. I had the story, unassailable, in my hands. I knew it was time to bring it into the open, to confront them with the evidence they had spent decades hiding. I rehearsed the words in my head, the calm precision with which I would lay the folder on the table and watch them realize the truth. There would be no theatrics, no yelling. The facts alone would speak volumes. The next day, at the family home, the air was thick with the familiar tension. The briefcase rested beside me, heavier now, with the weight of what it contained. My mother, Harold, and Dylan sat around the dining table, unaware that the decades of lies were about to be exposed. I opened the briefcase, letting the soft click of the latches echo in the room. I slid the folder across the table, watching as my mother's hand hesitated above it, then trembled as she opened the first page. Her smile faltered, the color draining from her face, her eyes widening as the layers of deception I had painstakingly uncovered were laid bare. Harold's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming nervously against the table. Dylan leaned forward, confusion and anger warring across his features. But no one spoke. They couldn't. I placed the court documents on top of the folder. The final verdict unmistakable. All funds misappropriated had to be returned to my father. The weight of justice was palpable in the room. And in that moment, I realized the silence wasn't discomfort, it was recognition. The truth had arrived. My mother's lips parted. But the words wouldn't come. Harold leaned back, his face pale. The smug arrogance replaced by the raw exposure of guilt. Dylan, seeing the reality of the stolen money, shoved his chair back and stormed out, leaving the house in silence except for the faint creak of the door. I took a deep breath, the tension draining slowly from my shoulders. I had carried this for 20 years, meticulously uncovering every detail, every falsehood, and now, the story could no longer be denied. I closed the briefcase and stood, feeling the late afternoon sun wash over my face through the dining room window. For the first time in decades, I felt the steady beat of calm in my chest. The storm had passed. I had exposed the truth, claimed the justice that had been delayed far too long, and stepped out into the world unburdened. It was over. I had done what I came to do. I watched my mother's hand shake as she flipped through the stack of documents I had laid before her. Each page bore evidence she could no longer deny. Emails, bank statements, digital traces of false accounts, all meticulously collected, every lie exposed. Her lips parted, then pressed together, as if trying to hold back words that refused to form. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and rigid. I placed the court's verdict on top of the folder. The heavy paper, a tangible reminder that the truth now carried legal weight. The document outlined in black and white what had been done, what must be returned, and the consequences for those who had manipulated the system for their own gain. I let the silence stretch, watching them process the inevitability of what they had done. Harold's posture faltered, the confident arrogance he had carried for decades collapsing under the weight of undeniable proof. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I saw the recognition in his eyes, the realization that the game was over and the tables had turned. Dylan, on the other hand, could not sit still. His face twisted in disbelief and frustration. He shoved his chair back abruptly and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, leaving only the quiet click of the latch. I remained seated for a moment, letting it all sink in. The years of tension, the subtle manipulations, the constant undermining, all of it laid bare and powerless against the truth I now held. I felt the culmination of decades of restraint, research, and patience converge in this single moment. Justice was no longer abstract, it was concrete, undeniable, and irreversible. My mother closed the folder slowly, as if afraid to see the next page, her hands trembling. Harold sank into his chair, his head bowed in quiet acknowledgement of defeat. The room that had once echoed with the sounds of casual dismissal, the laughter that had always excluded me, it was now heavy with a different energy, a silence filled with the weight of reckoning. For the first time in decades, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. There was no need. The documents, the evidence, the verdict, they did all the talking. The truth had spoken, and it was enough. I rose from the table, feeling the tension ease from my shoulders. As I gathered my briefcase, I looked at them one last time. My mother's eyes met mine briefly, a mixture of shame and something unspoken flickering across her expression. Harold avoided my gaze entirely. The moment was complete. A long-held chapter closed. I walked to the door, pausing as sunlight spilled into the hallway, warm and forgiving. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't feel the weight of injustice pressing down on me. The fight had been won, and now the world outside seemed a little brighter, the air a little lighter. The past had been confronted, and the present felt unburdened. I stepped out, the warmth of the sun on my face, a quiet affirmation that I was finally free from the shadows of the past. The story had reached its peak. The reckoning complete. And I could move forward knowing that the truth and my peace were finally mine. I stepped out of the house into the soft glow of the late afternoon sun. The air smelled faintly of pine and freshly cut grass. The kind of calm that only comes after a storm has passed. I felt it on my skin first. Warm and gentle. Like the world was finally acknowledging that I had endured, that I had won, and that it was time to breathe. I walked slowly down the winding path that led to the small lake behind the property. The water shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting gold and silver across the surface, rippling softly with the evening breeze. It was peaceful here, untouched by the years of lies, betrayals, and tension that had filled the walls of the house I had just left. My step felt lighter, as if the weight of decades had begun to lift from my shoulders. At the edge of the dock, I saw him, my father sitting quietly, his feet dangling just above the water. He looked up as I approached. And for the first time in 20 years, we didn't need words. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with understanding, with acknowledgement of the pain we had both endured, and with the relief that finally, the truth had been revealed. I sat beside him, careful not to disturb the gentle rhythm of the lake. For a long moment, we watched the sunlight dance across the water, each ripple like a quiet heartbeat, steady and reassuring. I could feel my own pulse slowing, my chest unclenching from the tension I hadn't even realized I was holding. Finally, he reached over and laid a hand near mine. Not touching, just close enough that it mattered. I didn't need him to speak, and he didn't need to. The absence of words said everything: that we were here, that we had survived, that we could begin again. It was a beginning that didn't require promises, just presence. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun and the sound of the water fill the space where so many years of anger, grief, and silence had once lived. For the first time, I felt the possibility of something simple, calm, connection, and a gentle hope. We stayed there for a long while, side by side. Two lives, once fractured, now quietly aligned. I thought of the years we had lost, of the lies that had been told, and of the careful work it had taken to uncover them. And yet, I felt no bitterness now, only a soft, steady relief that justice had been served, and that love, though delayed, could still exist in its quietest form. When I finally stood to leave, I didn't look back with anger, nor with regret. The lake, the sunlight, and my father's steady presence reminded me that life could be gentle again. I walked slowly away from the dock, feeling the warmth on my face, carrying with me the calm that comes when the storm has passed. The past had been faced, the truths revealed, and a new chapter awaited. Peaceful, honest, and unburdened.